I'd like to call to order the Friday, September 22nd, 2017 meeting of the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners to order. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner Valentine. Thank you. Suzanne, would you call the roll of the commission? And before we start with that, I had a call earlier from Commissioner Young, and he has a family emergency he's dealing with, and he's hoping to be here before lunch, but we'll see how that goes.
Chairman Wallace.
Here.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
Here.
Commissioner Albert.
Here.
Commissioner Barnes.
Here.
Commissioner East. Commissioner Hubbs.
Here.
Commissioner McGinn.
Here.
And Commissioner.
Thank you, Susanna. And also Commissioner East had a pre-planned event before she was even appointed to the commission, so that's why she's not here today. Will the County Advisory Board members please stand and announce themselves?
Foster, Douglas County Cap. Lynn Bunch, Mineral. Mike Reeves, Clark. Joe Corinne, Pershing. John Hyatt, Clark.
Thank you and welcome. Moving to agenda item number 2, approval of the agenda. Chairman Wallace for possible action. The commission will review the agenda and may take action to approve the agenda. The commission may remove items from the agenda, continue items for consideration, or take items out of order. Has the commission had a chance to review the agenda? Questions? Seeing none, this is an action item. I'll take it out for public comment on item number 2, approval of the agenda. Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Second that.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Commissioner Hubbs to approve the agenda as presented. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0 with Commissioner East and Young absent. Moving to agenda item number 3, member items, announcements, and correspondence. Chairman Wallace, informational. Commissioners may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. The commission will review and may discuss correspondence sent or received by the commission since the last regular meeting and may provide copies for the exhibit file. Commissioners may provide hard copies of their correspondence for the written record. Member items? Vice Chairman Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on the correspondence item, I received a series of telephone calls last week. I believe they were all from individuals in Florida. I believe they're with a group, I think it's called Bear Warriors United, announcing their disapproval of Nevada's bear hunt and their plan to boycott the state. I did give each of the 4 individuals who telephoned me the courtesy of a return phone call, spoke to them about the issue, explained to them the season setting, quota setting, and that they were a little bit behind the curve if they were objecting to the bear hunt at this point in time with its opening on Saturday. And I did question why they would single out Nevada as part of any boycott effort and asked specifically if they were intending to boycott every state, country, province that allows bear hunting. And there was no explanation as to why they wanted to single out Nevada other than we can only do it one at a time, in which my response was, it seemed to me if you're organizing a boycott, you could cover whatever geographic range you wanted to cover. So I had the discussion with them on that, and I believe was the subject of some social media postings as a result, although it was pretty fair representation of the conversation. I think they were more surprised that I extended the courtesy of returning their phone calls. So for the record, I don't have any written documentation of that other than the telephone calls I received. I also received an inquiry from an individual, Nevada waterfowler, about water delivery, and I contacted the department about that. The only suggestion I would have, maybe perhaps to the department, because I think there are some rumors or misunderstanding as to what happened or what is occurring, is to maybe contact some of the waterfowl groups and explain to them the situation so that people have an understanding. Other than that, the only other correspondence I received are the subject of an agenda item tomorrow, which were voluminous to say the least.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Commissioner Hubbs?
Yes, most of my correspondence too was for the agenda item that we will be discussing tomorrow. So should we just save that for tomorrow then? Thanks.
Yes. Further commission items? Director Wasley, do you have anything?
Thank you, Chairman Wallace. Nothing specific. I would note that I've received, as you have, considerable comment relative to one of our agenda items tomorrow. We've carefully cataloged, forwarded all those emails to the full commission. I know you probably received some duplicates on that, and then we've cataloged all those should there be any interest in the public viewing those, or just wanted to state that for the record.
Thank you, Director. And I too received quite a few emails, and any that I felt or could tell that were not sent to the rest of the commission, I forwarded on to Suzanne, and they in turn came right back around to all of us. So I think we're good on receiving the public input on that, and we'll discuss that more tomorrow. Anything further from the commission? Okay, seeing none, we'll close agenda item number 3. Open agenda item number 4, county advisory boards to manage wildlife. Member items, informational. CAB members may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action will be scheduled on a future commission agenda. CAB items. Come on up, Gil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Gil Yana, Carson Advisory Board. If you remember, about a year and a half ago, Carson City, because of the issue with a large number of resident deer that have taken up home in the city and causing all kinds of concerns from the homeowners and the people who drive around those areas, we put together that information pamphlet about what you can do to discourage the deer from being around your home. Plant different flowers that they don't like, shrubs that they're not friendly to, and to make sure that people, number one, don't provide them with subsistence, food, water, because they think they're doing them a favor when they're really not. And so recently we've gotten some requests from some of the other counties who have been experiencing similar problems, and we've given them copies of our pamphlets and the information that we received from Utah that made it very helpful and very informational to the people who are experiencing those kind of problems and what they can do about them, where they can go to get additional information. So if any of the other counties would like some information, just contact me or our chair, and we'd be glad to supply you with copies of the pamphlets and the email addresses and websites to go to get additional information. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. Further CAB comments? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission and close agenda item number 4. Move to agenda item number 5, approval of the minutes. Chairman Wallace for possible action. The commission may approve commission minutes from the August 11th and 12th, 2017 commission meeting. Has the commission had a chance to review the minutes? Comments or questions on the minutes from the commission?
Just one comment. On page 5, where we were going through the appeal process on the revocation of the hunting privileges, about the middle of the page, the one sentence paragraph says, the commission decided to remove Chief Turnipseed as witness. I think that should say the department, believe the department made the decision not to go forward with or Chief Game Warden Turnipseed as a witness and not the commission.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Further commission edits or questions? And I want to thank staff for getting those together. That's a lot of work every time, I know, and we appreciate it. So this is an action item. We'll take it out for public comment on agenda item number 5, approval of the minutes. Any public comment? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission and look for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to approve the minutes as presented with the change of the commission on page 5 to the department where it's referencing the decision to remove Chief Game Warden Turnipseed as a witness.
I have a motion by Commissioner Johnston and a second by Commissioner Almberg to approve the minutes as presented with the changes noted by Vice Chairman Johnston. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0. We'll close agenda item number 5 and we'll move to agenda item number 6. And just to let it be known, this appeal will be moved to a future commission meeting. So we will not be hearing agenda item number 6 today. So we'll move to agenda item number 7, the appeal Todd E. Wright for possible action. Mr. Wright is appealing the department's denial of his 2018 Master Guide license. And we'll start with Deputy Attorney General Stockton to give us a little background on what we're going to be doing today. Mr. Stockton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Senior Deputy Attorney General Brian Stockton. I'd just like to go through the statutes that control the hearing so we're all on the same page here. Nevada Administrative Code Section 501.165 governs the hearing, and subsection 1 is actually the one that applies to this particular hearing. As we're hearing, you'll be hearing the appeal of a denial of a Master Guide license. And so this hearing is de novo, which means you make a decision independent of what decision the department made. So you'll need to come to your own findings of fact and conclusions of law. So as you're going through the hearing, note the facts as you find them, and then we'll go to the conclusions of law after that. This is also governed under, the procedure is governed under Nevada Administrative Code 501.185 subsection 2. And so the order is that Mr. Wright will go first as the appellant. He'll be cross-examined and present his witnesses. Then the department will go next, and then either party can submit rebuttal evidence at the end if they need to. Then the appellant does the closing arguments first, then the department. And it doesn't say this in the regulation, but usually you let the appellant go last. So if Mr. Wright has anything to say after the department does its closing arguments, you should allow him to make any arguments he'd like to. And then you deliberate, and you can render orally your findings of fact and conclusions of law. And in this case, Mr. Wright has the burden of proof. So it's his burden to convince you that it's more likely than not, or that he should be able to maintain his Master Guide license. So as far as the statute that governs this, I'm sure the department will go through this, but we talked a lot about how much discretion the commission has. And in this case, it's governed by Nevada Administrative Code 504.671, which is the grounds for denial of a Master Guide license. And in that section, it starts out that the department may deny an application for any of the following. And then subsection 4 is the one we're concerned with most here, is that is what Mr. Wright having a conviction for violating a regulation of a federal land management agency. So that's generally the standard that you'll be reviewing it under. If you have some questions as we go along, feel free to ask. We cannot go into closed session, but we could take a break and I can meet it with you one-on-one as we talked about before. And we do have a change from the last time. We will not I would recommend you not allow public comment on this as it is a due process issue. So that's where we are right now. Any questions for me?
Questions for Mr. Stockton? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Stockton. So we'll get started with Mr. Wright then. Come on up.
If I could, just as a preliminary matter, I believe the parties have stipulated to all of the exhibits that were included in your packets to enter them into evidence. That's all I had.
Thank you. Mr. Wright.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question I'd like to, before we get started. Is each side intend to call witnesses?
The department does, yes.
And do you, Mr. Wright?
I do have one witness here.
Okay,
if he could-
in that regard then, pursuant to NAC 501.185, it says the commission may, on its own motion or that of a party, exclude witnesses from the hearing. On behalf of the commission, I move that all witnesses be excluded from the hearing until they're called as a witness, particularly in this case after reviewing the documents in the record.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, what that means is the witnesses will be asked to step outside. They'll ask not to talk to each other or discuss the case while they're there, and then they'll be called in when it's time for them to testify.
And just for the rationale for my motion is, this is commonly referred to as the Rule of Exclusion, and that witnesses are often excluded from a trial or evidentiary hearing so they don't hear what other people testify to in front of the judge or jury, so they can't conform their later testimony to what they've already heard. And so in this particular case, with a de novo hearing, I make that motion pursuant to the applicable provision of the Administrative Code.
So with that, do we need a second and a vote on that, Mr. Stockton, or is that?
No, that one's I don't know. I guess it says the commission, right, in that statute. So yes, you would need a motion and a vote, sorry.
Okay, I would second that motion. Questions from the commission on the motion? Hearing none, we won't be taking public comment on this item. So I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously 7-0. So we'll ask that the witnesses step outside until we call them in. Thank you.
And I would just note for the record, Mr. Wright, I know you might not be familiar with this type of process, but it's your obligation, it's the state's obligation to make sure their witnesses remain outside of the hearing room. So if someone comes in that you intend to call as a witness, the burden is on you to make sure they're outside, okay?
All right.
I just don't want anybody surprised by that.
Sure. Thank you. I just have the one there. If he steps in behind me, he'll have to tell me, so. Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give you my story. Before I begin, I'd like to know I take full responsibility of the decisions that were made up on Mount Grafton that day, November 26th, 2016, or 28th, excuse me. A little bit of background. I've been hunting for 40 years. I've been guiding for over 20. I never had a game violation. I've never broke a law. I've ran a good, clean business.
So, Mr. Wright, I apologize
Excuse
for
me.
interrupting, but this sounds like it's going to be partially as testimony, so could we have him sworn in
Oh,
as a witness at this point?
yeah, I don't. This is so new to me.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Wright, could you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you have given or will give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury of the laws of the state of Nevada?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Anyways, I've never had a game violation. I've never been in trouble anywhere. A little bit of background. I retired from the highway department, or the Department of Transportation, about 3 years ago, and guiding right now is my livelihood. It supplements. If any of you have any idea about a state retirement, you know they're not the best. Anyways, I spent 30 years with DOT, and so I'd like to give you a little the accounts of what happened that day. On the 28th, we got to the trailhead in the morning. It was dark. It took us probably 2.5 hours or so, 3, to walk up to where we were glassing from. It snowed. It was cold all the way up. It was miserable. About 12 o'clock, the weather broke just enough that we could see across the canyon. We found a bull that we were looking for. We harvested him. We were able, from there, we hiked about 2 hours to get around the canyon to where he was at. And I checked, it was about the 1,000-foot elevation up there. Anyways, the main part of what happened is from the time we deboned the bull, got him ready to go. We started down the mountain. It was about around 4:30, 5 o'clock. It was dark. It was getting dark. We had our headlamps on, and it snowed. It started snowing. We come down the mountain, and I don't know if any of you have maybe been back in there, but there's these what I call boulder fields. They're great big rocks with big cracks that we had to cross, probably 6 of them. I actually took my pack off, scooting across them. It's really thick. There's deadfall. There's a lot of. It was brutal. We were falling down. And it kept snowing. We're getting really wet. There was a lot of snow stuck to the trees. Anyways, we come down and we got really cold. We built a fire, rested for a while, took off again. Ron started getting really fatigued. If anyone's ever had a big heavy pack on of meat, every time you bend over or kneel down, it takes everything you have to get up. And he was getting worse and worse as far as fatigue and cold. We stopped and built a fire a second time. There we stayed for a while. It took a while to really get a good fire. No one could get dried out. We were all, it was cold. The wind was blowing. It just kept snowing. The snow would come in and out. Anyways, we walked from 4:30 somewhere around, figure midnight. We got over to a road where I made the decision, threw the packs down. BJ walked down the mountain to bring the pickup up. Me and Ron got in the mahoganies and started another small fire, trying to warm him up. He was shaking. He was getting clumsy. It was just a brutal. It was cold. Anyways, and I'm not denying there was a marker there, and there's a road that's beat all the way up in the mountain, and he brought the pickup up, and we loaded Ron up and brought him off the mountain. That's when this other gentleman showed up, and I never did talk to him. He was kind of going off. I had a pickup down there. My pickup was broke down, and after that we loaded up and headed home. Got home around about 3:30 in the morning. But I made the decision because my client was getting sick on me, and he was not going to make it from there down. There's hindsight, yes. There's a lot of things probably could have tried to do different, but we didn't. Not thinking too clearly when it's like that. Anyways, I met with the BLM. I've paid a $1,200, and over a $1,220 fine with them. I'm on some special stipulations, and I think you have that in your package of what I've given to you guys that I go by. And so 1 year probation. I did call Officer Eller when I got the letter. I thought it was over. I didn't realize I was gonna have problems with the Fish and Game or the Department of Wildlife. I think where I'm at here. When I talked to Officer Eller, he said that he had my application and he saw that I'd paid the fine because I wrote it on there, and he said that's an automatic act of guilt and they'd have to deny my license. I did ask him if he had read any of the evidence, and he said no. And I realize they're busy in there, and I know they have a lot of applications to go through, but when it comes to someone's livelihood, I just feel that they need to look into things a little more personally. And I'm not being, that's just how I feel. Also, when I had a formal meeting with the BLM, they also told me in the meeting they did not feel that what happened, that I should lose my livelihood on this. They've let me keep my permits and everything else. So I think that's oh. I also learned in the Wilderness Act, you can drive in to retrieve a person if it affects their safety and health. And also in the BLM meeting, they told me that they could give me permission to drive in. I did not know any of this. And I've looked into the Wilderness Act since all of this, and I've actually learned quite a bit on it. But that's pretty much what happened that night. So, is there?
Mr. Stockton, real quick. Now, at this point, is the department ask him questions, or can the commission, or what's the procedure at this point? I just want to keep it in order so that we're good.
Yeah, both the commission and the department can ask questions, and generally the department would go first, but it's at your discretion whether you allow commissioners to ask questions first.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with the department then.
Thank you, Commissioner Wallace. Commission, I have some questions for you, Mr. Wright. Could you repeat how long you've been a master guide?
A master guide, exactly a master guide, I don't know exactly how many years, but I believe I've been guiding for over 20 years.
And you've been hunting for how many years?
40.
Are you familiar with the area you were hunting in?
Most of it, other than up where we were at, when you look down off into it, you couldn't tell. It was dark. You can't tell how rough the terrain was when we dove off into it. It was our easiest walk or shot off of there.
Had you been hunting in that area before?
Not that particular area. I have been more on the south end or the north end of that mountain. A few times I've gone either side of that, but I have not ever been in that canyon.
And during that hunt, I understand that you were on that mountain for several days. Had you scouted up that area during that hunt?
Not me. My sub-guide had been hunting him. I was gone sheep hunting, and I actually just showed up the very last day. I got in that night and just happened to go with them that last day. I had not been with them that one day.
And was the area that the elk was harvested from, is that substantially different from the rest of the mountain, the areas that you had hunted?
Some of it, I personally try not to go in where those boulder fields are. Like I said, I usually stay closer to the north end or the south end where it's most clients, you don't have a lot of clients that are in very good shape, to be honest with you. So
Did you meet with Mr. Hall prior to the hunt?
I did earlier that week before I left, I believe.
Did you ask him any questions about his physical health or physical condition?
I did not, but my sub-guide had. He'd been, yeah.
Did he appear to be in good physical condition to you?
Yeah, he looked, he's good physical condition, I would say. It's just what broke him down was the heavy pack he was packing. And
prior to the hunt, did you have any concerns about him being able to pack out of the area?
I wasn't with him enough to really, like I said, I was just there with him the one day.
But you didn't have any concerns about his physical condition?
I didn't know.
You know how difficult it can be to pack an elk out from a hunt, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Do you have any idea how heavy the packs you were packing were?
No, they were heavy. We deboned the whole elk, plus we had the cape, and we'd cut the skull cap off, and everyone had a good load. Yes, as far as weight-wise, I don't know.
And what did you say the elevation is in that area?
10,000 feet, probably where we were at. The mountain runs from 6,000 to 10,991.
And this was in late November, correct?
Yes.
The 28th, 29th of November?
Yeah.
So it would be typical, or you wouldn't be surprised to have very cold temperatures at that time of year, at that elevation?
No, it'd be typical.
And it wouldn't surprise you that there would be even snow falling at that time of year, correct?
Correct.
So you admit that there were 3 BLM violations that you were convicted of?
Yes.
And those were all related to entering the wilderness area, correct?
Yes.
And you admit that you knew that you were in a wilderness area where motor vehicles shouldn't be driven?
Yes, I admit that all the way, yes.
And I believe the individual who initially confronted you as you came out of that area was Dana Johnson. Are you familiar with that name?
Yes.
And that's the individual who came up to your group?
I never did talk to him. I was looking for jumper cables. I was trying to get my pickup started when he pulled up there.
Did you hear any conversation that he had with members of your group?
No, not a lot of it. I more heard what the conversation was after we got in the pickup to leave.
Have you been able to read statements made by Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson states that he confronted a member of your group and asked if you'd driven out of the wilderness area, and that initially there was a denial that you'd been in the wilderness area or had driven out of it. Did you read that?
I read it.
Do you recall making that statement to Mr. Johnson?
I did not talk to Mr. Johnson.
Do you know who would have made that statement to Mr. Johnson?
I believe it was BJ. That would have been my sub-guy.
That was your sub-guy?
Yes.
Did you hear BJ say that you hadn't been in the wilderness area at all?
No, I did not.
Did you see the statement that when Mr. Johnson confronted the group, someone in the group said, well, at least we walked in to kill it?
No, like I said, I could not hear. The wind was blowing, and I was more worried about getting my pickup started and going home than anything. I don't hear that well anyway, so.
Mr. Wright, could you just speak up a little bit?
Oh, sure. I'm
Yep.
sorry.
I just don't hear very well.
I don't either.
And so you had no conversation at all with Mr. Thompson, correct?
I had no conversation with him at all.
Do you know if anyone in your group explained the circumstances that you were under to Mr. Johnson?
No. Other than the little bit of conversation we had in the pickup about him yelling at him, and that's about it.
So you don't know if BJ or anybody else said, hey, we were in an emergency situation here?
I don't. And I believe I stated that my sub-guy tried to explain it to him, but that's it.
If I could show you in Exhibit 11 is a statement of Dana Johnson. On page 1 of an email to Brian Eller, the last paragraph, if you could read, I guess the second line down, there's a portion I'd like you to read.
This is who?
Dana Johnson's statement.
Oh dear. I was angry and frustrated at this point. Do you want me to read it out loud?
Yes, please.
At this point, because many hunters, including myself, work very hard to hunt in the wilderness and pack out animal under our own power. In my mind, they did not have reasonable explanation for driving into the wilderness area, and I told them so.
And so, according to Mr. Johnson's statement, thank you, he didn't believe you had a reasonable explanation, or your group didn't have a reasonable explanation for driving into the wilderness area. Is that what you understood from his statement?
Well, yeah, that's what it says there, but Mr. Johnson wasn't up there either, other than at the bottom of the mountain.
Sure, but you don't recall any conversation with him that would have made him understand the reasonable nature of your entering that wilderness area?
No, I had no conversation with the man.
Once you left the wilderness area, did you take Mr. Hall to receive medical attention?
We went straight into town and got him back into the motel and got him warmed up in the pickup, got him out of his wet clothes and got him into the hotel room there.
Was there any specific medical attention that you provided to him, either as you were getting ready or at the
Other
as you were
than
staying?
just getting him warmed up. We had no dry clothes when we come down off the mountain.
After that night, did he receive any medical attention that you're aware of?
I do not know.
Several days later, you were contacted by Stephen Culver with the Bureau of Land Management. Do you recall that?
Yep.
Did you initially state to him that you had not entered into a wilderness area?
I did. I wanted to see, you want to protect yourself when somebody jumps on you. Sure. But then I also told him right away that yes, we did go in there and why we did it.
And did you also state to him that you knew it was wrong to have entered into that area?
Well, yeah. You know it's wrong, but what do?
Did you state to Mr. Culver the circumstances that you've explained here, that Mr. Hall was you were worried about hypothermia with him?
Yes.
Have you reviewed Mr. Culver's report of this incident?
Yes.
Does he make any mention of emergency situations or hypothermia?
No, he did not.
He does mention that, however, that Mr. Hall was tired, correct?
He's very fatigued, yes.
And did you see that in Mr. Culver's report, that he mentioned that Mr. Hall was tired?
I think I did, yes. I've read that a couple times.
I'll provide on Exhibit 10, page 3 out of 3 is the narrative of Stephen Culver's communications with you and Mr. Whitney, who is your sub-guide. If you could, the 5th paragraph down describes the contact that Mr. Culver had with you. Do you see anywhere in that paragraph where he mentions any emergency situations or that Mr. Hall was suffering from hypothermia or pre-hypothermia type condition?
No, I don't. No.
Do you know why Mr. Culver did not include that information in his report?
I do not.
Eventually, you agreed to pay fines on all 3 of the BLM violations. Is that right?
I did. He had a lot of threats in there that, and not knowing the Wilderness Act at all, if I would have known, probably would have tried to fight some of this, but to fight this in federal court, I can't afford that. I thought it'd be easier just to pay these fines and
So you didn't contest any of the 3 violations, correct?
no.
And so eventually, upon paying those fines, you were convicted of the 3 BLM violations?
Yes.
Later on, BLM has sent you a letter explaining that in addition to the monetary fines, they'd put additional administrative actions on you, correct?
Yes.
And as part of that, they informed you that they would be notifying NDOW of the violations and conviction. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. I think I have that letter somewhere. Yes.
I have in Exhibit 13, the 3rd and 4th pages are a letter from the U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, to Mr. Wright. Could you read the highlighted number 4 on the first page?
Notification of violation and administrative section will be communicated to all Nevada BLM districts and NDOW. Yes,
And you received this letter from BLM, correct?
I did.
And so you were notified that NDOW would have the information of the conviction
Yes.
sent to them? On the last page, the second to last paragraph, could you read that first sentence?
It's kind of blacked out. The BLM takes violations of this nature very serious.
Is it your understanding that in the BLM's eyes this was a serious violation?
Not after I had the meeting with them. I mean, they do take it serious, but after sitting through the meeting with them, the part you have out of there, they did feel that the livelihood shouldn't be taken away.
And did you meet with them before or after receiving this letter?
I met with them, I believe, after this.
Mr. Chairman, you
Oh.
shouldn't allow coaching
I,
at this time.
sorry.
I'm sorry, did you meet with BLM before or after receiving this letter, do you recall?
I believe I'm thinking after. Yeah, because here it says the formal meeting. This is asking for the formal meeting.
And when you met with BLM, did you at that point say, hey, you know, there's a misunderstanding, this was an extreme circumstances with emergency implications here, and these convictions should be rescinded or appealed? Did you have that conversation with BLM?
I had the conversation, but that was never an option that I knew I could do, so.
Did you ever ask, in that meeting, did you ask about appealing the convictions?
I did not.
You mentioned that you were packing out with heavy packs, and that Mr. Hall and everyone became tired and wet. Did you at any point get rid of the packs, ditch the packs, and try to make it down the mountain?
No.
No? And why not?
Well, that's something that just wasn't feasible to do. Mr. Hall was leaving the next day. It was his last day of the hunt, and BJ was going back to work. Leaving your packs, you have all your stuff in it anyways, other stuff that you need. No, it's just wasn't something even thought about doing.
And in these conditions that we spoke about, would you anticipate, or would you anticipate that you might be tired and cold at the end of trying to pack out a large amount of a heavy pack with elk?
Yes, but we didn't anticipate how rough and how miserable to crawl through the deadfall and what we went through.
Do you know if there was cell service in that area?
There's no cell service.
I have no further questions right now.
Questions from the commission? Vice Chairman Johnston?
Yep. Mr. Wright, if Mr. Woodbury asked you this question, I apologize for asking again, but I want to make sure I'm clear. When you got back to town after you came off the mountain, did you contact the BLM or did the BLM contact you?
The BLM contacted me.
Why didn't you self-report the fact that you'd entered into the wilderness area on a motorized vehicle on an emergency situation?
I don't know. With all the crap going on with the BLM and what's happened in the past, they're kind of in my mind, it's not. You just don't do that. They're usually not very forgiving. And I was surprised at the meeting I had with them. They were really good to work with. I was impressed, to be honest with you.
Now, when Officer Culver contacted you, did you initially tell him that you never entered the wilderness area?
I did. Yes, I did.
So you started off the conversation with the BLM with a false statement?
I did. Yes.
Then the BLM put some conditions on your permit, your licensing permit?
Yes.
After your meeting, did those conditions remain in place?
Yes, they do, and I've followed them to a T.
You said it was your client's last day?
Yes.
He was planning to leave Nevada the following day?
Yes.
And your sub-guide was going back to work the next day?
Yes, he works for the railroad and has blocks off or whatever.
And you guys were the three of you were trying to pack it out in one trip?
Yes.
Did that have something to do with the fact that BJ was going back to work the next day and your client leaving the state of Nevada the next day?
Yes. We didn't want to leave the meet to walk out of there.
I mean, you could have done more than one trip. I mean, you could have lightened the loads.
Well, we'd already been walking from 4:30 that afternoon till midnight.
I guess what I don't mean to be flip when I hear that, but you've got to expect hours of walking if 3 people are going to pack out a bull out of a wilderness area. I mean, that's not an easy job.
No, it's not. And
I sympathize with, it's cold, it's snowing, it's that, but I mean, if that type of exception exists, I mean, it's pretty much always cold and snowing that time of year on these mountains hunting elk.
yeah, but I think it was the physical part of it that wore everyone down bad. It was the deadfall and trying to find our way through in the dark. I don't know if we could have found back up through there. And these boulder fields that I'm talking about, we crossed probably 6 of them, and I don't know if you've ever tried to go across these things. They're just really dangerous to try to get across, and to try to go back up the mountain across them is just, you just want to get the meat across and down and not go back over. It's just too dangerous.
How many vehicles went into the wilderness area?
1. On an existing road that was blocked off. And you can still see the road to this day. It's been there forever.
Commissioner Allenberg.
In your contract agreement with them, do you spell out whose responsibility it is to pack up?
Yes.
And is he part of that commitment to pack up the meat, or is that responsibility?
It's our responsibility, but most hunters want to be involved and part of their hunt. Yes.
And how many loads does it typically take you to get?
Oh, if on how many people? 1 or 2? I mean, if
I'm guessing that it depends on where it's at, but
right.
in a particular case, if on the mountain at that kind of elevation, how many trips would have you normally taken to get that out?
With 3 of us, we could do it with 3 when it's boned out, not quartered. And I mean, completely boned out, no bone.
What would be typical? Typically haul out, 3 people will pack out a bull?
Yeah.
Commissioner Allenberg,
Or
could you
4.
please speak in the mic so we can have it on? We need to ask all the commissioners to speak into the mic as well as we can so we can get everything on the recording.
Would it be typical for you to go back the second day and finish packing it out, or do you always hunt with 3 so that it's always a single
No,
event?
we have gone back before, but in this case, 3 of us were there, and the terrain was so miserable coming down off of there. It's just to get back up through there would have been, I don't know how to explain. The way we came around in there was a bit easier, and the reason we didn't go back that way, it was steep and going uphill, and we had to crawl over some ledges, and there was no way we were going to get those heavy packs. It was slick and windy up over the ledges to get back down off of there. But we have gone back in, but a lot of times we have enough guys there to pack it out the first trip.
Commissioner Hubbs.
I wanted to know, in your experience as a master guide in the past, have you ever had anybody become injured or fall subject to hypothermia while you were out in the field?
This is the first time I've ever had myself in this kind of situation.
Did that gentleman, Mr. Hall, need to be treated for hypothermia when he got back to town?
Other than just getting him warmed up and getting him rested, no. I mean, it was 2:30 in the morning. The nearest Our nearest doctor would be down in Caliente, Nevada, which if we needed to get him down there, we would have, but he seemed to be better after we got him warmed up in the pickup, got him back to the motel.
And in your experience over the course of years that you've been hunting, have you ever decided to refrain from taking an elk that was too far out or in areas that were too hard to pack out?
Yes, I have.
And under this circumstance, you felt that you were capable of doing it?
Yes, I did. And like I said, I showed up on this hunt the very last day, and I know they had walked up to where they were glassing from, I think 2 other times during that week. So I felt he was capable. I think what broke him down was the heavy pack and the fact that the terrain that we came through it is absolutely miserable in there. Like I said, the deadfall and the rock fields and the mahogany. You have to backtrack. You go around. You backtrack. It falling down takes everything you got to get back up, and we did run out of water. I had 2 frozen bottles of water that we tried to melt by the fire. It didn't work very good. We did pass. We got a little bit melted out of the one, but.
And then when you finally did reach your vehicle, your car wasn't running as well. You had to jump it.
I had to go back the next day to get my pickup out of there.
Thank you.
Further commission questions? Commissioner Valentine.
Thank you, Chairman Wallace. Mr. Wright, approximately how far did you drive into the wilderness?
I'm not positively sure, but I think probably on the road that we drove up was right around 3 miles, probably in. I know the road, it's bare all the way up a ridge till it hits some mahogany patches, and I think it's about 3 miles in there. I don't know exactly.
All right, thank you.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
Mr. Wright, I was reading your letter to this commission on this appeal. It was only after you received notice that your master guide license was going to be suspended for 2018 that you then read the Wilderness Act and found the emergency exemption?
Well, it was after I had a meeting with the BLM. I didn't know anything about it. And
right.
that's
So
when
see,
I
I mean,
looking
here's
into
the problem I have with the sequence of events. You don't talk about an emergency situation when you're contacted by Officer Culver. You first deny that you went into the wilderness area. Then you said my client was tired. Then you find out the ramifications from NDOW. Then you look at the Wilderness Act, and then all of a sudden there was an emergency situation for the health and welfare of my client. Do you understand how that sequence of events causes me to question the story?
Yes. But Officer Culver, we told him that the client had got sick up in there, and that's what we'd.
But I mean, the BLM, after you told them all that, still said that you're precluded for 1 season from the Mount Grafton Wilderness.
Yes.
And put other special conditions on your permit. So it seems that you gave the full explanation to the BLM that you're giving to this commission, and they still, one, levied the fines, as well as put special conditions.
I talked to the head of their names. He was never in there when we sat down and talked with Mr. Herder. Just a minute. Gotta find. Here we go. Michael Herder, a Mindy Sill, a Leslie Riley, and a John Miller, who I met with. I don't know how they communicated or whatever, but that was in the formal meeting with them, and they're the ones who told me that mainly Michael Herter, he could give me permission to go in the wilderness area if there was an emergency. And that's,
Did you,
and I did tell them the same story.
how far were you and your client and your sub-guide from the road when you made the decision to retrieve the trucks?
We were right there fairly close. BJ was a bit ahead of us.
So is it a situation where you got to the road and then say, let's go get the trucks?
What's that?
Was it a situation where you got to the road and said, let's go get the trucks?
No, me and BJ discussed it a little bit after that last fire, and when he got there, he dropped his pack and took off down the mountain and got the pickup. And I stayed back with Ron, and like I said, we worked on getting a fire going in the mahoganies.
And at that point in time, you thought your client could not make it 3 miles down a road?
No, he was done. He was wiped out.
Did he ask you to retrieve the trucks? Your client?
No.
I don't have any further questions.
Anything further from the commission? Commissioner Hubbs?
So, right now, his master guide, it's suspended. Is that the status of it? The master guide license is suspended just for 1 year, 2018? I just wanted to clarify that.
It said it was denied for 2018.
Further questions from the commission? Okay, I think at this point now it's for Mr. Wright, if he has a witness, is that where we would be now?
Correct.
Do you have a witness to call?
Yeah, Ron Hall's here.
So now, Mr. Chairman, normally the procedure would be for Mr. Wright to ask questions of Mr., I think it's, who's coming, Mr. Hall? But since Mr. Wright's representing himself, you have the discretion to just let Mr. Hall testify, so.
Okay.
Do you want
Can
me
you bring him in? Yeah.
Sure.
Mr. Wright, you can come back in if you can hear us. Will you grab him, Joe? Vice Chairman.
Sir, could you please state your name for the record?
My name is Ron Hall.
And could you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury of the laws of the state of Nevada?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if I may make a recommendation, given that Mr. Wright is representing himself, I think Mr. Hall should just be able to let us, without like any type of attorney examination, just tell us what happened.
Yes, I agree with that.
So if you could, Mr. Hall, I'm sure you understand why we are here. Can you just tell us what happened?
So when we started out that morning, or?
That's up to you.
So I think it was the 28th of November. We parked at the wilderness zone, walked in, set up on an elk that we've been watching for so many days. We've been up there a few days before, a few different times before actually. Was able to spot this elk, 12 o'clock, 12:30 maybe, shot, killed the elk, went around the mountain, got to him, took a few pictures, took quite a while to get over to him. It had been snowing. We actually got him boned out, I would say, I think it was right before 5 o'clock. I remember the sun was starting to go down. We started heading out, starting to get dark, starting to get cold, and we started just heading out, and got pretty rough. It was pretty much downhill the first part, pretty steep. I did a lot of falling, fell down a lot. Had to use my gun to kind of stabilize myself, so it really getting worn out. And I actually ran out of water, and I was, I actually had, I think one of my flashlights went out. I think Todd had given me another flashlight so I could kind of keep going because it was pretty dark, obviously. And we stopped a few times, made a fire, and I had been lagging behind BJ and Todd most of the time. It was just, it was very difficult. It was getting pretty tough. I ran out of water. Todd gave me some more water, I remember. Ran out of that. And I know you're not supposed to do it. I started kind of eating snow, but they didn't see me because I felt like I was dehydrated and I needed to, get something in me. And I know you're not supposed to do that, but I felt like I just have to do this. And I remember we stopped a few times, maybe 2 or 3 times, made fires, tried to warm ourselves up. I remember sweating real bad, taking clothes off, trying to dry yourself out. And I do remember one time we stopped. I couldn't even tell you how far away we were to actually head out. But, you kind of lose track of time. I remember that I either looked at my watch or somebody told me what time it was. And I remember it was around 9:30, 10 o'clock when we were building this fire. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know how we're going to get out of here. I mean, and it was pretty cold. I can't remember if it was still snowing or anything at that time. So we took off again, and I can't remember if we built one other fire. I really can't remember how many we did at the time. And it got to a point where I think Todd thought that, it was not getting good for me. And I kind of felt that way too, but you never want to, tell yourself that. You got a heavy pack. And so I think BJ, at one point, Todd and BJ decided he needs to go out, get this truck, come up so far. When we got to a certain point, we would just stop and wait for him. And he came in and got us, picked us up. We drove back down, and then we got confronted by one of the ranch hands. That's pretty much it.
Commissioner Allenberg.
Are you used to packing heavy loads? Have you packed? Is this something that you normally do
I've done
as
it
well?
before, but probably not quite that heavy.
I'm assuming you had spotting scope, coats, all that stuff suitable for the day, in addition to your load?
Oh, yes. Sure did. And I remember the BLM actually contacted me afterwards. I told him the same thing. And he asked me why I couldn't just drop your pack and head out. And, honestly, at the time, never gave that a thought at all. Looking back, would have been a good idea to do that. If you drop your pack, you got everything in it. How far am I away to get out of this place? How good a shape are you in? I don't know. And, that decision was made. And
It took you 3 hours to walk up in the morning with your normal load, your normal hunting load, which is
yeah, I would say it took a little longer than that.
which is quite a bit.
Yeah, I bet it was probably 3 hours up.
And assuming if you dropped everything and just got yourself out for an emergency situation, I would assume it'd be half of that, maybe an hour and a half.
Maybe, possibly. It was snowing that day. That affected a lot, and, I don't think it would have been half that, honestly, completely wore out. Been hiking for, I don't know how many hours, 6 hours, maybe 7 hours, back down, and I bet I fell 25 times. Just to get yourself up, you're completely wore out. I don't know. The thinking process at that point maybe wasn't there. it's hard to say.
Mr. Hall, was there ever a discussion of how many trips it might take or a reason for doing it all in one instead of making smaller loads out?
No, I think it was storming. We wanted to get out of there. Let's see if we can load everything in, get out. And that's what we did.
Commissioner Hubbs?
I just have a question about dropping the pack. If you drop your pack, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand, you risk then having the meat taken or obviously not being able to find it again. But is there a real risk to dropping a pack, just out of curiosity? That's more toward any sportsman on the commission.
It's very common, as a matter of fact, that a lot of these people will take 2 to 3 days to get a single animal out. To get it out with 3, I ain't gonna say it's not doable, but it is a tremendous amount of work.
Oh, it was a lot of weight. You know, the biggest thing with dropping the pack is you have everything in there. You know, I mean, your survival stuff also in there. You know, extra clothes, different things. So it's not just the meat, you're dropping your pack. I mean, you're walking away from it.
Further questions for Mr. Hall?
Just a reminder, Mr. Chairman, to give Mr. Woodbury a chance to ask
Yes,
questions.
I was going to go to Mr. Woodbury. Seeing nothing further from the commission, Mr. Woodbury?
How many days had you been in that area hunting?
We'd actually, how many days did we walk in? We walked in 3 different times. That was the 3rd time we actually walked in.
And did you walk in on the same kind of route that you ended up packing out of?
Well, not really, because once we packed out, we had to go around the mountain, and then we came back another route. I did not know. We went straight down the bottom into a drainage and started coming up the other side. So, no, it wasn't.
So you packed in 3 days, you said. So you were surveying the general area and getting familiar with, I guess, the terrain.
We walked to a certain spot. We could spot the elk from the road down below. And we walked in and tried to get on them 3 different times. And that was the 3rd time. Finally saw them out in the open.
And you knew that you were pretty far into the wilderness at the point that you harvested that elk?
Oh, yes.
That it would be a pretty difficult walk back?
Without a doubt.
I think you've been asked, but there was no discussion about whether you guys should take a lighter load or take the elk in multiple trips?
So like I said, when we were on the side of the mountain, I think there wasn't a big discussion about a lot. We were really trying to just get out of there, and we just tried to load everything in. Each guy took X amount in their pack and just headed out.
And you were scheduled to go back home the next day?
I was.
Describe the conditions there. There was some snow. How it was falling sporadically during the day.
Pardon? Oh yeah, storming up there. We couldn't see. You couldn't even see till I don't know, at least noon, maybe longer.
And afternoon was when you actually shot the bull elk, right?
Was. We had a little break. The clouds lifted.
And from the afternoon on, how was the precipitation? How would you describe it?
How was the weather?
Yeah.
I think it was just snowing off and on.
So it wasn't like blizzard conditions that night?
At night, not once we got in the canyon, it was not.
How about in the afternoon of that day?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was still blowing, still snowing.
Were you involved in any discussions with Mr. Thompson once you guys left the wilderness area?
I don't know who Mr. Thompson is.
You were confronted by an individual once you left the wilderness area after the truck.
You're actually sitting right there, yes.
And do you recall being confronted by an individual there?
Oh yeah.
Did you have any discussions with him?
I never spoke to him.
Did you hear the discussions with him?
Oh, he was ranting and raving at us, yeah. definitely.
Did you hear a statement that, or did you hear him ask if you guys had, or if or why you had entered the wilderness area with the vehicle?
Oh, I heard him say that, yeah.
And do you recall someone stating that your group had not taken a motor vehicle into the wilderness area?
No, I don't remember that.
Do you recall someone stating, at least we walked in to get the elk?
No, I didn't listen to it. I mean, I heard him ranting, and I wasn't really trying to pay attention to what was going on. I was cold, freezing. We had a problem with the other truck. My concern was we just needed to leave. We needed to go at that point. I mean, it might sound bad, but that's the way I felt. I mean,
did you ever receive medical attention?
no.
You got back home to, I guess, got back to you're staying in a hotel,
Stay in a little cabin.
little cabin. Did you receive treatment there?
No,
Just got out of your wet clothes and warmed up?
I did.
And did you head back home the next day?
I think we left that night, actually, the next night. Pretty sure we left the next night. I don't remember exactly. But I know we didn't get in till, geez, I think it was maybe back to the cabin at 3:30 in the morning. And I know I dried off and went to bed.
Did you suggest that that the cars or that a truck be fetched to pick you guys up?
I did not.
Do you know whose idea that was?
I really don't know. I'm assuming it got discussed between BJ and Todd, but I'm not sure. I was lacking behind a lot. I got not sure how far away. You know, I couldn't tell. I couldn't see their lights, but there was a lot of time I was quite a ways behind them, I think.
And did Mr. Wright or Mr. Whitney ever make a suggestion to you about leaving the pack behind?
No.
Unloading to be able to get down the mountain?
No.
Okay. I don't think I have any further questions.
Okay, I believe Vice Chairman Johnson.
Mr. Hall, did you ever tell Mr. Wright or BJ, I can't make it down? I need a ride out of here?
No.
Okay, unless there's anything further from the commission or the department, we'll move to the department's presentation.
The department will call Tyler Turnipseed as a witness.
Mr. Johnston.
Just lost in thought there for a minute. State your name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Johnston. Chief Turnipseed, Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed for the record.
Could you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury, the laws of the state of Nevada?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Woodbury?
Thank you. Could you, I guess, generally explain the application process for a master guide?
Yes, Chief Game Warden Turnipseed. A master guide application has to come in the year before the year that they want to guide in. For instance, if a person wants to guide in 2018, they must apply in May of 2017. So we have quite a bit of lead time in a master guide application. as opposed to a sub-guide application. The sub-guides can apply anytime throughout the year. So a person applies, sends in their application either for a new license or a renewal, like in this case a renewal, and then one of my staff members reviews those applications, checks them for any criminal history, that sort of stuff, any negative information that would impact their license, and then makes a decision either to issue or deny that license application.
And what standard would you consider you hold master guides to?
There's a list of criteria I'm sure that everyone has looked at in NAC 504-671 that talks about reasons why the department may suspend, revoke, or deny, and those include anything from DUI convictions, fish and wildlife convictions, threatening, intimidating, that runs the gamut. There are 19 subsections in that law or in that regulation. This one specifically that we're talking about today is a conviction of having violated a regulation of a federal land management agency.
And so you're referring to NAC 504.671, subsection 4, stating that the department may deny an application for, revoke, or suspend a guide license for any of the following: conviction of having violated a regulation of a federal land management agency.
That's correct, and Federal Land Management Agency, of course, being BLM, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
So when there is a conviction of a violation of a regulation of a federal land management agency, what do you consider in determining whether to deny a master guide application?
We would look at the egregiousness of that conviction, and obviously the regulation gives the department some discretion here. It says may suspend, may revoke, may deny, rather than shall in the case of our criminal ones like the last one we heard. And so the department does have some discretion there, and we look at each one on its face value of how egregious was the violation. One example that I thought of the other night was, I've occasionally heard of people in a national park receiving a citation for, parking in the wrong spot or backing over, causing some resource damage as they park their car or something. Clearly, one of those we wouldn't think of as something that should affect their guiding privileges, and so we look at it sort of on a scale of magnitude of how severe the violation was. In this case that we're talking about today, the conviction, of course, was for violating wilderness laws and motorized vehicles in wilderness. Obviously, a lot of people hold the wilderness laws and regulations in high regard, and we felt that this one met that threshold of egregiousness, if that's a word.
So to be clear, in NAC 504.671, it says the department may deny an application. So in your example of parking in the wrong spot or turning around with a vehicle and running over sagebrush, a person might get a conviction from the land management agency, but in that situation the department may decide not to deny a license for that kind of conviction, correct?
That's correct, and in our thought process in making that decision, obviously we look through any of the reports that we receive. In this case, it was the BLM officer's report, the witness statement from the reporting party, those sort of things. We review all that as part of that thought process and picked out some pieces of those reports that led us to our decision.
And what kind of consideration does the department give to emergency types of situations when considering whether to deny an application such as this?
I think we would weigh that on an individual basis. If a report came in that said that these people did what they did because of a broken bone or a heart attack or something like that, obviously we would consider that an extenuating circumstance as to why you would take a motorized vehicle in a wilderness area. Again, we weighed those facts in this case and didn't see anything in the reports that made it out to sound like an emergency situation.
Who was involved in making the decision in this case?
That would be myself, Chief Game Warden Turnipseed, and then Brian Eller. He's one of our game warden captains, and he's also our guide coordinator who reviews all these applications when they come in.
And so what information did you have available to you when you were reviewing this case?
We had the report from the BLM enforcement officer and the witness statement from the reporting party who initially reported the incident.
And you reviewed both the BLM case report and the witness statements prior to denying the master guide license?
Yes, sir.
If you could turn to, I believe you have an exhibit book, Exhibit 10. The third page in is the narrative of communications that Stephen Culver with BLM had with Mr. Wright. The fifth paragraph down, it says, I contacted Wright, and discusses Mr. Culver's conversation with Mr. Wright. Was there anything in that, I guess in this narrative, that indicated to you that there was emergency situation meriting the entry, or meriting not denying the master guide license application?
We reviewed that paragraph specifically and found no nothing in there that indicated there was an emergency or anything urgent or exigent.
That report does mention that the client, Mr. Hall, was too tired to hike out. Why did you not feel that would be sufficient to not deny the application?
I would say just because it doesn't indicate an emergency, we read that specific paragraph in our decision-making process and keyed in on that sentence right there. Wright said that they drove in to retrieve, and this is a quote from the report, Wright said that they drove in to retrieve their client, Hall, who was too tired to hike out. Wright said he knew it was wrong, but said that the area used to be open to vehicle. And then Wright said he initially lied because he was worried about losing his master guide license for his guide service. So that sentence right there, retrieved their client, Hall, who was too tired to hike out. We saw nothing in that paragraph that indicated any emergency, any injuries, any medical situation, nothing of real urgency or exigency. Anybody who hunts or hikes or backpacks has been tired, has been cold and wet before.
If you could turn to Exhibit 11, the second page there is a voluntary statement by Dana Johnson. You know who Dana Johnson is?
Yes, sir.
And this statement was taken on 11/29/2016. I think the second page of it states it was at 11:11 a.m. Did you review this statement when deciding whether to accept or deny the application?
Yes, sir. And just as a point of clarification, I think he gave the statement at 11:11 a.m., but the incident occurred the prior night, just past midnight, I believe.
Yeah, I think the first section there says 11/29/16 at 12:15 a.m. So
yes, sir.
12:15 in the morning, and he's giving this statement almost 11 hours or so later that same day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Was there anything in this statement that indicated to you that this was a true emergency?
No, sir.
If you could read the last, starting with the last three lines of the first page of that statement onto the first and second line of the second page.
Yes, sir. And in this statement, Mr. Johnson is describing his contact with the hunters on the mountain. This is a sentence that we keyed in on here, and I'll begin, as you said, in the middle of the third to last line. The report states, quote, "The one man acknowledged that he had walked up into the wilderness to kill a bull elk, but drove in to pack it out." Continues on the next page. He said, quote, "At least I walked in to kill it," end quote.
And what did you understand from that statement?
Reading that statement on its face value, used that in our thought process to deny, and basically on the fact that it said that they walked into the wilderness to kill the bull, but then drove in to pack it out. Again, saw nothing in there that indicated any sort of emergency or exigency or urgency for a medical condition.
Did you see anything in the packets at all of the information you received from BLM regarding the convictions, mentioning hypothermia or that we were cold, we didn't think we could make it out, things of that nature?
No, sir, I don't think hypothermia was mentioned anywhere in any of those reports.
Ultimately, why was the decision made to deny the application?
We made that decision to deny simply because we felt it was a conviction of a federal land management agency regulation, which obviously the regulation says we may deny for. So we looked at that conviction and said, was there any reason or exigency or urgency involved in that incident? From the reports we had, we decided that no, there was not. Like I said, with wilderness ethic and that sort of thing, obviously people hold wilderness in high regard, and people hunt those areas because of their wilderness area. Roads are excluded, motorized vehicles are excluded. Because of that, animals tend to congregate there, especially older age class trophy animals. That's why they're in those areas, is because A, the habitat's good, and humans have to work a little harder to get in there. There are other hunters, there are other guides who maintain horses and mules throughout the year so that they can hunt these areas and avoid a survival situation. And so for those reasons, we felt like the wilderness trespass issue was a reason to deny.
What are the conditions typically like in the Mount Grafton wilderness area at this time of year in late November?
Yeah, I believe this incident was on November 29th. Certainly White Pine County or Lincoln County that time of year can be pretty severe. If I were hunting elk on November 29th and on Mount Grafton, I would expect it to be really cold. I would be prepared with the right clothing and the right fitness levels and the right decision-making process about whether to go after an elk or not, based on what I thought the weather forecast was going to be. And I would expect Mount Grafton on November 29th to be pretty cold and a good potential for being wet and cold and miserable.
And is that something that the master guide would be tasked with, understanding where they're hunting, what the conditions might be at the time of the hunt?
Certainly, sir. I would expect that to be one of the reasons why a non-resident hunter would contract a guide to know what the conditions are going to be like in a given area at a given time.
And in this area, would you expect hunters to experience cold and being tired while they're engaged in a hunt or packing out a hunt?
Certainly, sir. I think that probably adds a little bit to the allure of a wilderness backcountry hunt, that it's going to test you physically and mentally.
Mr. Wright currently has a 2017 Master Guide license. Is that correct?
Correct.
Under NAC 504.671, could the Department of Wildlife have revoked or suspended his license for this current year, 2017?
Yes, sir. If you read 504.671, the first line says the department may deny an application for or revoke or suspend a guide's license for any of the following. There again, we sort of give that varying levels of magnitude of how severe a penalty would be. For a current year's license, had we gone after revoking the current year's license, felt that would have been a much bigger imposition on Mr. Wright, simply because well in advance of the hunting season, they've got hunters booked, clients arranged, contracts in place, deposits paid, all that sort of stuff that's in process for the current guiding year. So in May, when we received these applications for the 2018 period, certainly the 2017 season is already well underway as far as preseason arrangements. So felt that it wasn't of a high enough level to revoke the current year's license, just that maybe ought to sit out a year for the next coming license.
And isn't it true that in his appeal packet, Mr. Wright requested being at this hearing because he did in fact have other hunts scheduled on other dates.
Yes, sir.
So while NDOW could have also revoked his 2017 license and deny the 2018, they chose just to deny the 2018 license?
Yes, sir.
I don't have any further questions right now.
Mr. Wright, do you have any questions for Chief Turnipseed? Mr. Wright, do you have any questions for Chief Turnipseed? Okay. Hearing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for questions for Chief Turnipseed. Vice Chairman Johnston.
Chief Game Warden Turnipseed, just to follow up on that questioning from Mr. Woodbury, is there conditions that can be put on the master guide license other than suspension? And the reason I ask that question is the BLM did not revoke Mr. Wright's special recreation permit, but put some conditions on it. And I didn't know, and I don't think there are, I was just curious whether or not there were similar type conditions that can be put on master guide license under our structure of laws and regulations in the state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Johnston. No, I'm not aware of anything in our statutes or regulations that allow for specific stipulations on a permit. It's pretty much in or out, deny or grant.
And did the department, in deciding to suspend Mr. Wright's license for 2018, take into account that the BLM did not revoke his SRP?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Johnston. We took that into account. Quite honestly, we expected the BLM to not issue him a 2018 permit. We waited for their process and before we made the decision on ours. And when we found that they did issue a permit but with stipulations, we looked to see if that was an option for us, but didn't see an option to give stipulations. As the agency who regulates the guiding industry, and with all the complaints we hear recently about guiding in eastern Nevada, we felt that this would be one that maybe we would go a little bit further than the BLM did in denying an application rather than issuing with stipulations.
I guess from all that, then the department had to either give Mr. Wright a free pass or suspend his license for 1 year or revoke his existing 17 license.
That's correct, sir.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think they can actually even go up to 5 years. Is that right? You can deny or suspend, or is it 5 years the maximum, or did I read that wrong?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Hubbs. I'd have to go back and read through that. It's a little bit different than with criminal convictions for wildlife cases that have the demerits. Those ones are pretty specific about revoking for 5 years or 10 years or 1 year. In this case, I believe it's a little more subjective about the time. In our thought process, I guess this would be a bridge that we would cross next year, but certainly the applicant would be able to apply in 2019 or for a 2019 license.
Further questions for Mr. Turnipseed? Okay, seeing none, we'll start with the closing by the department.
I believe Mr. Wright has an opportunity to provide rebuttal evidence in response to the state. Mr. Wright, if you have anything to present. Okay, just for the record, Mr. Wright is shaking his head and indicating he does not have rebuttal evidence.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Mr. Woodbury for the closing.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, under the NAC, Mr. Wright would go first as closing arguments, if that's the stage we're at.
Okay. Mr. Wright.
I just want to reiterate, this is the first violation I've ever had. I've never been trouble in anything. I feel the decision I made, I'd make the same decision again if I was in that same situation, which I hope I never am. This is my livelihood, and it affects a lot of people in my family right now. That's about all I got, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr. Woodbury?
Thank you, Chairman and the Commission. So under the relevant NAC section, the department may deny an application for a conviction of a violation of one of these land management agencies. Here we had conviction of 3 separate violations, all stemming from the same event, but actually 3 convictions. And this is an unfortunate circumstance where many things probably could have been handled differently, but they weren't. They could have, better scouted, better prepared, better planned for this event. When it was obvious that people were getting tired, they could have dropped packs, unloaded, reduced weight loads, and made sure that they got out safely. This is a wilderness area for a purpose, as you heard Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed testify. This is an area where there are animals present, in part because it is a wilderness area, in part because vehicles don't access this area. And because of that, hunters go to that area, know they're one, up for a challenge, but 2, that they might have access to animals that aren't available in other places because it's protected. There's no contention here as to the underlying convictions or knowing that it was wrong to have gone into the area. The question is, are there exigent circumstances, other circumstances, true emergency, which would allow these violations, I guess, to be looked over. And the problem with that is that every time that Mr. Wright or his group were confronted shortly after this happening, there was no mention in the record of any emergency situations. We had Dana Johnson come in contact with them right at the time that they were leaving the wilderness, and there was no mention to him that there was anybody suffering from hypothermia, that there were circumstances above and beyond a normal hunt in cold weather. There was a statement that, well, at least we walked in to kill the elk. We had to drive out to get it. And above and beyond that, I guess, when they were first confronted by Mr. Johnson about having entered the wilderness area with the vehicle, they denied it. That was true to form again when the Bureau of Land Management contacted Mr. Wright to discuss this incident. Mr. Wright denied ever having entered the wilderness area. Once he did state that he had entered, we have no record of him mentioning that he thought his client was going to suffer from hypothermia or could not get out of the area. He mentioned that his client was tired, but that would be something to be expected after a long hunt, and packing down a heavy pack out of this wilderness area. And as Vice Chairman Johnston pointed out, it's only after a denial of the application and a discussion with the Bureau of Land Management that the thought or idea of emergency situation, which would excuse perhaps the violation, came up. But again, in the underlying conviction, he never asked for that to be contested or appealed based on emergency situations. So we're in a situation where there were convictions, and it's up to this commission, obviously, to decide whether the application should be denied or not. But we heard that under the normal practice and procedure for the Department of Wildlife, they do look into whether there are extenuating circumstances which would make it reasonable for them to have entered into the wilderness area. And this isn't a case where it was just a brief dip into the wilderness area, but 3 miles up into the wilderness area. And this isn't a circumstance where we have any evidence of real medical injury. The client, Mr. Hall, didn't receive any medical assistance. He went home, he dried off, and the next day he was headed back home. And so it's the position of the department that under these circumstances, there wasn't justification for having a motor vehicle enter that wilderness area, and that the master guide license should be denied, because those master guides really are put to a higher standard where they need to be aware of the conditions, aware of their clients, aware of the circumstances they're going to be getting into. And if we make exceptions for people entering these wilderness areas when clients are tired and other things, if there's not a true medical emergency, that puts at risk the wilderness areas themselves. And so it's, again, the department's position that the master guide license should be denied. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Woodbury. Mr. Wright, do you have anything further? Okay. He acknowledges that he had nothing further, and I'll bring it back to the commission for discussion and a decision. Commissioner Hubbs?
Yeah, this case actually is more difficult for me than I thought it would be, because I guess one point that's not coming up, I realize these folks are representing themselves here today, and I felt that the testimony was fairly credible. I think there's something to be said sometimes about stopping or trying to plan around not having a medical emergency as a master guide, and I'm wondering about that, because I think there's a threshold, and you're watching your client out there. One thing that was compelling to me is that he stayed with his client. I think he could have made it out, but he kept his client at a fire. Once they reached the road, and I think it's just, to me, it's really hard to say, but then I know it's from an enforcement perspective, who's to tell when everyone gets tired and when that vehicle should be able to come in? So, it's a floodgate issue. So if you let one person get away with it, then that could be an argument for many more to come as well. I'm interested to know more about how the commission feels about it, but I honestly felt that the testimony was credible. I see it from both perspectives, but I think that there is something to be said about protecting a client out there if you feel that he can go into some type of medical emergency.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. I think my comment on the situation is I do agree with you that the testimony is credible, but where I kind of have a problem is when they made it all the way to the road. I can a little bit sympathize with not leaving your packs and dropping everything out in the middle of nowhere in the dark that you may not find again. But when you know exactly where that road is, to me, I feel like there could have been some other options taken of dropping packs there and making it to the vehicles. And that's where I had a lot of sympathy for them, and I've been in situations like that where you're tired and you don't feel like you can go anymore. But when you reach the point where they were 3 miles from the vehicles, if they could have dropped packs and walked to the vehicles, we didn't have a guy that actually went to see a doctor or received treatment or anything at that point. If he'd have received treatment or something that, tired is tired. Everybody's been tired, but sometimes you just have to push on and, like I said, leave a pack and come back to it. That's an easy place to find it if it's right on the road and you know exactly where it's at. And that's kind of where I'm at. I'd like to hear some more from the rest of the commission as well. Commissioner Allenberg?
Yeah, I think the testimony was all credible. I think that the client has an incredible amount of heart. He didn't give up, and what they asked him to do is, it's a job. And I guess this is where I have a problem. He has a wealth of experience. He's been in this boat many, many times. I think personally he may have actually jeopardized his client instead of protecting his client. by allowing him to continue with that load instead of dropping the load and just making provisions to come back. It just happens regularly. And again, it's because he has so much experience, in my opinion, that he should have known better.
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share the same thought process that Commissioner Almberg did. This went from taking care of a client's interest on a hunt to really transitioned into, if it was in fact an emergency, it didn't just happen as you got closer to a road. It was a, there's a responsibility to take care of the well-being of a client too. And that didn't just happen. That developed over the course of the day. And I think it occurred way before it got to the, this is just my thought. And this isn't a reflection of who you are as a person. It's just my perception that I think that that decisions should have been made earlier if it was in fact an emergency to do something about it, hunker down, get rid of the packs, whatever it was. And I'm struggling with the timing in the series of events, because I do think if there were concerns for the well-being of the client, I think decisions would have been made. There would have been different course of action way earlier than that. That's just what that's just how I feel about it. That's just what I'm.
Thank you, Commissioner McNinch. Commissioner Valentine.
Thank you, Chairman Wallace. I'm pretty familiar with that area. I'm sure John is too. For them to make it as far as they did and still have 3 miles additional to go in the circumstances they were in, if he was not currently, in a bad situation, after 3 more miles, I'm sure he would have been probably hypothermic. So I tend to feel a little bit of sympathy towards Mr. Wright in this situation, and I'll be curious to see where the rest of the commission is situated.
Commissioner Barnes.
I guess I'm in agreement with a lot of what I heard already. I am extremely sympathetic. And the fact that they did what they did to get that animal that far, to me, is pretty amazing, really. I've been in situations like that, and I weakened a lot earlier. And I went back the next day. And I mean, I never even thought about it. I'm gonna get out of here and come back with a little more help and whatever we can to get it out. So, but I am sympathetic, and I understand what the guy did. I mean, because if you have a client, he might not have been doing okay, but there's always the risk of cardiac arrest and exertion after that also. But then again, if you let something like this go, then all of a sudden there's a precedent to start letting motorized vehicles go into a wilderness for this or for that, and pretty much where does it stop? And so I guess that's kind of where I am.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
If there was a situation where Mr. Hall had fallen and become injured, which happens on hunts all the time, and the decision was made to get a vehicle to get him out of the wilderness area, I would look at this very differently. I think I have the same view that's been expressed by Commissioner Almberg and others, is to the extent an emergency existed, and I'm not so certain it did, I'm just going to assume that right now. It seems that emergency arose in this wilderness area on this hunt because 3 individuals made the decision, because one was going back to work the next day. It was the last day of the hunt. Mr. Hall was going to leave Nevada the next day. Let's pack this thing out in one trip. And I have to question whether or not that decision created the situation in which the decision was made to retrieve a vehicle and drive into the wilderness area. And if that was what created that situation, I don't have much heartburn over that master guide being suspended for 1 year for creating that situation, because that situation shouldn't have arose. You know it's going to be cold. I mean, just so many things go through my mind in this. I mean, and I am sympathetic that this is someone's livelihood. But when your livelihood is based upon a license you hold, and I know precisely what that feels like, you have to hold yourself to a standard that you don't engage in conduct that jeopardizes the license. So I'm sympathetic to that issue, but that goes with the territory of being a master guide or any other type of licensed professional. I think of comments where you're out on a hunting trip and you're having fun, and then someone shoots an animal and you're like, yeah, the fun part just ended because now the work begins. And I have a very tough time as well that one, it was not self-reported. Mr. Wright knew of the consequences of a BLM violation may jeopardize his master guide license. There was no self-report to the BLM or any other law enforcement agency. And instead, when first contacted by law enforcement, Officer Culver, Mr. Wright did not tell the truth. I have an issue with licensed master guides receiving a telephone call from a law enforcement official, and Mr. Wright admitted this, and I asked him, is this segment in Mr. Culver's report true? And he said yes. That yes, in fact, he falsely denied entering into the wilderness area when contacted by Officer Culver. That was, in my mind, a very egregious thing for a licensed master guide to do. It was only then once confronted with the evidence and that, it was like, yes, okay, we did it. My client was too tired. I think that has to be weighed into account here as well under the circumstances. I note that the BLM had its investigation. They viewed it as a serious offense per the record. It's right there that they stated that. And I mean, one of the stipulations was no a prohibition of commercial outfitting and guiding in the Mount Grafton Wilderness area. But I thought even a more severe condition than that was the next one, which was an individual trip plan will be filled out and turned in for every client before the guided hunt takes place. So the BLM did not obviously think this was a insignificant matter, and they had the facts before them. So, and that was one of the reasons why I asked Chief Game Warden Turnipseed, can we put conditions on a master guide license? And the answer to that was no, and I didn't find any. And I think that puts everyone in a all or nothing type of position. Do you have to give a free pass to this violation or not? And I also think some people might say, you know, it's really not that big of a deal. The road existed. We drove up a road a couple miles. No harm, no foul. I can't look at it that way. The laws are there. People who hunt in wilderness areas, as made clear by the department, do so for specific reasons. And when you go into that type of area to hunt, whether it's a wilderness area, other places inaccessible by motorized vehicle, you know what you're getting into. And it's your responsibility to be able to get in and get out safely. I understand if there's a true emergency, an injury or something like that, but that wasn't present here. And there was things that could have been done to follow the law. I'm absolutely confident that things could have been done to follow the law. I mean, the packs could have been dropped at the road. I mean, a 3-mile walk's just down a road. I don't know what this road was like, but it was a road that a truck could drive on. So 3 miles down a road is not that far. It's just not. And the packs could have been dropped on the road, no risk of losing them. Get the client down, and the guides walk back up and pack out the rest. Or do it the next day. That's something that was an option that was available. But rather than pursuing that option or other alternatives, frankly, I think that it was, well, the trucks are right down there. BJ, run down there and get the truck, and we'll just get it out of here, and probably no one will find out. And I think it was also that go back to the cabin, get warmed up, and go home the next day. It just doesn't, you know, I wasn't there, but when the emergency situation wasn't communicated to the BLM, in the first instance, in the first interview, and only came to light after Mr. Wright looked into the Wilderness Act. I have a hard time with that timeline.
Further commission comments? Okay.
I guess my final comment is I believe that we are supposed to orally issue findings of fact, conclusions of law.
Correct.
And I'm prepared to make that motion, but I think we've been going quite a while, and before I make that motion, I would need a few minutes. If the chair would indulge us maybe with a 15-minute break?
Absolutely. So we'll take a 15-minute break and come back at 11:50.